I'm probably going to get skewered no matter what I say. Music and like other creative endeavors are always kind of like a side hustle, for lack of a better word. I don't think there is a world where anything interesting or compelling gets made or happens without criticism.
The interesting thing I was reading is that you already had a very successful career in music before, and things were doing so well with the label. You moved along, and then out of nowhere, you decided to get involved with fashion. Can you tell me a little bit more about that decision and that transformation?
Definitely. Yeah, so I come from the music industry. I had the opportunity to work with a number of different artists, across the spectrum at various points in their career, from, people like Steve Lacy to Omar Apollo and Girl in Red and Gus Dapperton. And what was so amazing about the label that we were building, AWOL, is that, a lot of these artists, in many ways were very scrappy kind of go-getters in the early, beginnings of their career, and built these, amazing artist careers kind of from finding and connecting with different people. And so, so many of these artists would bring in friends who would do things like, graphic design or creative direction, or, any kind of visuals, or you name it, just to kind of help supplement and support their campaigns. And so throughout that process, I just got connected to like an amazing network of creatives and people, not just in New York and LA, but just like outside of the US as well. And, the common denominator for so many of these artists was like, they were able to share and, build a platform for themselves, through like social media, namely like Instagram and whatnot. But, so many of them wanted to express their work on a more tangible kind of physical canvas. And, without having the resources, that's not really possible, especially when it comes to things like making clothes. And so, as we were preparing to sell the label and thinking about what to do next, an opportunity kind of came up to find a way to collaborate with these artists and bring them into a larger kind of canvas. And that is what kind of formed the basis of the pair.
Were there other things you were considering outside fashion?
I think for me, fashion felt like the most logical next step in terms of, one, I think, so much of what happens in music, I think people maybe don't necessarily always see that it is a very collaborative and, kind of large group project. And I think fashion in many ways functions similarly, where it's like there are, people that do different things, and those roles are very important to kind of come together and create something that, like, forms like a larger whole. And so I think for me, fashion was something I'd always been interested in since I was a kid, just, in terms of watching some of my favorite artists like introduce me to like different brands and clothes that I'd never seen before. And then I think on top of that, it just seemed like such a logical kind of next step in terms of how much fashion and music have fed off of each other, at least like throughout my formative years. And so, yeah, I'm not really sure what else I could have done.
Was that a big, I want to say like a learning curve for the process from, doing music for so many years and being successful at it and then start a new fashion brand that has a twist as well? What was the biggest, I think, not challenge per se, but the difference in terms of pace, workload, things that you immediately had to kind of overcome?
Yeah, I think in many ways it was kind of like going back to school, which was really amazing. I think for me it was so fun to learn about the process of like making clothes and kind of what that, looks like in terms of both timelines, but also how, that happens. I think there is so much of like at least for me as an outsider, there's a bit of like a mystery around like, okay, like how do people kind of come together and make a collection and then like, get that out there. And so I think, it was amazing to be able to like one, have a team for us to work with that, were so helpful in being like, yep, this is like how these things work. But I think simultaneously, like I think a lot of it was transferable skills in terms of, so much of it kind of boils down to thinking about like, okay, cool, what is the story that we're trying to tell? What makes this worth believing in, and why is this significant? Who are the different people that we're working with to kind of do this? Why are their stories important to this larger story? And I think kind of that aspect of brand building, I think that was very applicable from what we were doing in music and kind of bringing that over. And then I think, in terms of like the technical hard skills, it's been an amazing kind of process for us to just kind of continually learn and understand more about, just the craftsmanship that goes into making certain things. I think just even learning about something specifically, like, oh, like how like knit sweaters are made, and how like why different weaves and things like function the way that they do, and so on and so forth. I think yeah, for me it's always just fun. I know for some folks that might be a little mundane, but I was just like, yeah, this is very interesting to kind of see how things are made from start to finish.
Take me back to those early days when you have those conversations about the branding, the identity, things that you wanted to pursue, the mission, kind of mission statement, what you stand for.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, first and foremost, this is one of the main motivations in starting Le Pair was to create this platform and canvas for these artists, so for myself and the rest of the team, it wasn't a priority for us to be front and center. We kind of wanted the artists that we were working with and collaborating with to kind of be, the real kind of faces of each collection, as we would bring them in to kind of collaborate with us and work on the larger story. I think from thinking about the brand itself, we wanted to really think about how can we do something a little bit different in terms of just like, not only like the kinds of clothes that we were kind of making, but also from like a narrative brand building standpoint, how can we explore, interesting themes around like masculinity, so one of the things that we kind of touch on is something we called like a sensual or more expressive masculinity. And I think with that, it was, really important for us to kind of find ways to not only involve interesting like creatives, like from like photographers and videographers that, we felt have like a very evocative and very like like distinguishable style or distinctive style. But I think, is also just like, all right, how can we kind of go a step further and not just look to create things that aesthetically are pleasing, but maybe, that don't have as much of a substantive like narrative grounding. And so, I think one kind of combining all those pieces, it was amazing to kind of bring in like, okay, cool, why did we choose to work with this artist? And kind of, I think, tying all of those things back to like the various intentions around like, all right, this is why we love this person's work. For this season, we were kind of exploring like these themes. And so it made sense to kind of tie their work in here. And then I think, from a larger standpoint, I kind of wanted to bring in all of these folks and have the brand kind of serve as in many ways like an incubator where it's like, okay, cool, I've like, if I'm a young kid, like, and I just like I'm starting to get into stuff, and like I see that like all of my favorite artists or all of these artists or people that I know of have like worked with this brand, I think that's always inspiring in many ways. And I know even for myself when I was younger, where it's like, okay, cool, like I see like this person doing things with this brand, or this person doing stuff with here, and it's like wow, like that's amazing that they can find all of these people, and especially bringing people that maybe don't have like a traditional background within that specific field to kind of come in and do something.
And how are you finding those collaborators? Are from references, people that you admire, finding perhaps on social media or going to schools? How are those people that have already collaborated with you came to your attention?
It's been amazing. I think for the majority of the artists that we've worked with, we already knew from, working with them in music, or I think we had just been fans of their work for years. And, for me, it was a great opportunity to be like, hey, I love what you do and have a fun project that I think would be amazing to kind of do with you. Otherwise, yeah, I think sometimes it has been, social media driven or just word of mouth. I think the beauty of like being able to work with people is that they are just, especially when they get the chance to really like do something that they're super passionate about and proud of, they're just like, hey, have you seen or met this person and seen their work? Like, they're incredible. I think it'd be great for you to talk to them. And then, that's also kind of formed the basis of like a few collabs. So I think it's been extremely organic, which has been amazing. There's been no point of like, oh man, like, we met this person and like feel like we have to work with them. I think it's been very much, synergy driven in terms of just like from a personal level of like, this person understands what we're doing. I feel like there's a shared appreciation around like what we're trying to create together. And I think, there's, I think, appreciation on the other side too, of just the trust that we extend to like our collaborators. I think it's so easy, and I have seen before where artists or creatives are brought in and then are basically told what to do, and kind of defeats the whole purpose of why you go to those people to begin with. So I think for us it's been really important to empower these artists and let them know that like, hey, like this is a two-way street. Obviously, like we need to figure out certain things in terms of like, okay, this idea that we have, like, is this physically possible, but otherwise, like, what are the best ways for us to kind of like figure out how to have your work live on this larger canvas, which are some of the clothes in each
And
collection.
that would be my next question. What would be the parameters that perhaps as a brand you are setting for the artist? It is a canvas, but with some sort of, perhaps limitations and boundaries that sometimes can really, incentivize creativity when you have those things, upon you. But for you as a brand, when you have this conversation about, the new collection, new collaboration, what are the things that it's important for you that they have to make sure they're following that the checklist, for example?
Yeah, I think it's this is kind of where, from our team standpoint, and that too from our designer Sam, it's interesting that like we'll come in and say like, hey, these, we've been sitting with excuse me, these references, this artist, or we've been looking at these things, and this is kind of how we see your work in conversation with that. And so I think there is definitely like a guide and like a shared, I think, understanding or language of like, these are the things that we're looking at that are kind of forming the basis of what we're hoping to make this season. And I think, we can either, make things from scratch or figure out ways of reimagining existing works that you already have that, kind of fit within to that. So I think, the freedom kind of comes from thinking through, where or how does the like artwork kind of live on a garment, or at least even in terms of like application. I think like, one of our collaborators, we'd taken these like hand drawings she'd made of like Korean wrestling figures. And, one of the things we did was like turn it into like this like French wallpaper effect that kind of lives on like as like camo on like workwear pants and like a deck canvas jacket. And I think what was so fun was for her was she was like, wow, I've never seen my work as a repeat print pattern. Like I didn't think I could see it, reinterpreted this way. And so I think, there is that kind of fun back and forth of like, them sharing work with us and being like, oh, like, I don't know if you've seen this, or I think this could be amazing on this. And then us kind of having a chance to mess around with it and be like, cool, this is how we, slightly like played with it and like reimagined it to live on this garment. And they're like, wow, that's beautiful. I didn't even know that like that is possible. I think this season we just did we introduced our first selection of like knit sweaters. And so one of them works with this artist named Drew Tyndall. And so he's an amazing like 3D animator and illustrator and painter. And so we took, one of his animations and like slowed it down and took like a frame or two and ended up turning those like kind of spindly spiral figures in there into like a mohair sweater. And so, I remember when he came in for the first time to like see the pieces in person, he was like, wow, like I didn't even think it would be possible to make like a knit out of like this specific drawing. And so I think it's fun to both from like a tactile, like physical standpoint, and to from like a more conceptual, like how does this live on a garment that isn't just a basic like screen print. I think that's where it really starts to get fun.
If we were to kind of zoom out and look to all the collaborators with the brand in the previous years, and so are there a common denominators or like threads that they all have in common in terms of personality or vision that they all share?
Yeah, I think the thing that, we love about them the most is they all have a very distinctive voice and then like a very specific point of view. I don't think they all are different from each other stylistically, which I love and I think has, come out in different ways. But I think what's made them all very compelling is like when you see their work, it's their work. I don't think that there's anyone that we've worked with that I would, say feels very much like the other, or like I would reference as being similar to like very recognizable artists that most folks know. And so I think I appreciate that they all have very distinctive and like strong points of view when it comes to their work itself. I think personality wise everyone's kind of different, but I think yeah, there is, I think actually I will say I think one common denominator too is like an openness. I think we've been really grateful that like on the artist sides that we work with, there is an openness and willingness to kind of experiment and try things and really have an opportunity to like see where the process of like collaboration might go. I think there is sometimes understandably like fear for some artists where it's like, oh, I don't know if I want to like I don't want to deviate too much from what I know or like what I've already done. And I think, what's been amazing with all of our collaborators to date is that everyone has been like, yep, that sounds great. Like, let's try that. Or like, there's like this real willingness to really just continue to like tinker and experiment and like, just reimagine things versus just saying like, this is the work. You need to figure out what to do with it. And that's that.
Would you, is it fair to say that perhaps this openness is what has made the company, the brand to stand out? Because normally fashion brands is very much a vision of one creative director or one person that has a team behind it, of course. But at the end of the day, it ends up with one voice being able to interpret their vision for collection, whatever they want to do. But you guys have managed to, perhaps from the background of music, to be a far more collaborative and bring pieces and people to implement and enrich the brand as well. Is that something fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what makes the process, really compelling for us is that like, as a team, there is a shared, I think, vision and idea of what we want to do. But then what's wonderful is opening that up to these artists and having them come in, it becomes a bit more of like a conversation. And like, that I think makes it feel less, kind of top down, if that makes sense. And so I think, like you were saying, the traditional creative director model obviously is reaped tons of benefits and I think like works very well in many cases. I think for what allows us to be ourselves and kind of have the brand be something a bit different is I think that there is this like kind of committee approach to thinking about like, all right, well, what are we choosing to do this season? Who are we going to work with? Like, how is this going to come out through, how we shoot our lookbook and like our campaign and like these visuals and like what do we want to do like in the store and in person around it.
Yeah, and of course, it is a business, and beyond sales, what are some of the metrics that you see as with a successful campaign? It would be press related, critics, or someone specifically you're able to collaborate. How are you seeing define success at this point with Le Pair?
Yeah, I think, obviously the traditional metrics of, I think, press coverage and I think those kinds of industry driven accolades are amazing. Obviously I will happily always welcome those. I think, obviously I think now to definitely social media growth has been a big driver for us in terms of like, all right, how are we getting the brand out there, how are we able to find more people to work with, or how are people finding us, and so on and so forth. I think also just from I know this is super anecdotal, but just even from like a word of mouth standpoint, there is something to like, when we meet a new person or you're in a different city or somebody just hears the name and they're like, oh, I've heard of your brand. I've seen it before. Like, this is amazing. Or, being able to go to like other cities and do events and whatnot, and people are really excited about it. I think it's just this wonderful thing, kind of watching it spread and start to like, really like, as people come to you and talk to you about it, it's like, yeah, like this is getting out there, this is growing, and we can feel it, and the momentum is building. I think, for us opening the store in New York and then this new store that we're opening in LA have been just, another part of that story in terms of really just kind of seeing like the momentum and the growth happening in real time. And I think, for us, it's been an incredible just journey, just kind of seeing this happen and partially surreal sometimes where it's like, yeah, we're really excited to have, people, as many people as possible interact with the brand, and I think like having that physical touch point is always such a crucial part of it. And so, yeah, I think all of these things are crucial pieces of the puzzle. Obviously, like, yeah, as a business, sales is kind of top of the list in terms of like how are we being
Yeah.
able to define growth. But I think in general, just it's building that like cultural value, I think, is so crucial for us, even as we've been doing like events with like musicians and other creatives and whatnot. And every time they come in and they're like, yeah, man, like I've been a fan of the brand or I've been watching it or like this is amazing. I think those kinds of yeah, those kinds of compliments I think are huge too, just in terms of like, okay, amazing, like we can see that this is starting to spread, and or is really getting out there and growing in a way that feels natural and like organic in the way that we want.
I love it. It must be very nice also when you walk around, you see people wearing your stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we have these yellow bags, and so it's fun when I'll just be like outside or walking down the street, and I just see like these just like our bright yellow bags with like Le Pair written on them, walking about.
You can spot it from far away.
Yeah.
How do you balance this dual identity? as a clothing store, a brand, but also an event space. What are some of the challenges and opportunity that does come with it?
Yeah, I think, from the outset, when we were opening our New York flagship, the goal was to have it function as not just a traditional retail space, but also as, an event space and kind of a community space in that way. I think, I think back to when I was younger and just kind of seeing a number of stores in New York and where I grew up and in other places where it was like, okay, like they would host things. And I just kind of always found that to be, really inclusive and welcoming in the way that, like, yeah, not everyone will always be able to afford what we sell, but I think, what makes our brand more compelling and I think allows us to build like a meaningful community is our ability to host events and host interesting creatives and people from within and outside of our network that are just doing interesting things and want to have a space to be able to host that gathering or what have you. I think obviously there are challenges with like, can we always fit as many people as we would like into the space itself, or like is this is there always like a risk of like, gosh, I hope the store doesn't get trashed? But like, yeah, I think what is wonderful is that, one, everybody that's come to our events has been super respectful and there have been I have no complaints about people that have attended it. But I think it's always kind of made my day when, I'll talk to people or even just overhear folks being like, yeah, like that's amazing. Like I went to like, PÈRE for this artist who I'm a big fan of, or you just get to kind of see like, I think people have like a different interaction with one, these artists, and two, just a different interaction with like a store. I think so often like I've been to stores where people are not friendly, and they're just kind of like, listen, if you're not here to buy stuff, like get out, And so I think having that relationship, I would much rather that than have it be a space that's, a bit more, let's say, not inclusive.
Is that a concept that you still want to implement in the future stores? As you mentioned, LA will be next, that you want to be able to host events? Because I think there's a difference between cities and dynamics and the culture itself. I mean, New York, where you are located, there is the whole community, there's the energy around this. So you can see those events being quite successful and people enjoy themselves. But as you become a bigger brand and you start finding yourself in different locations, different cities, uh, is they tend to try to maintain, preserve that identity and continue that core value of being a community driven brand.
Yeah, I think what makes this work, to be honest with you, is the fact that like so much of what drives, the events and where our stores are is that like it is about the community around us, between New York and LA, like these are very creative cities and we are lucky that like between, our existing networks within music and creative spaces and whatnot, and also like the amazing people that we have working in our stores and collaborating with us and just kind of within the larger family, there's just this, I think, genuine desire and appetite for like, okay, what can we do, like, well, what things can we host here, like what's possible. And so I think, yeah, obviously like events in LA will look somewhat different from New York, just based on like the nature of it. And I think the fact that like it's a both culturally and like infrastructurally just a different place. But I think one, the common thread in my mind is that like there are artists everywhere. There are like creatives everywhere, and there are always like, I think there is just a genuine appetite, amongst like people my age and younger that have just like, all right, like how do we, where are, you know, events and spaces that like we can go to like meet people that might be into the same things like us, and I think that's kind of the bigger thing, is it's just like, all right, like folks are always looking for like in-person experiences, and I think especially kind of in recent years it's like, yeah, how do we continue to find those and find them in such a way that it doesn't just feel like work or industry driven, but more so just like, yep, this amazing thing is happening here, like and it's free, I'd love to go, like we should go check this out, like this should be amazing.
Ah, that's super fun. I've seen some images and videos, and it looks like it was a good time. So I'm sure people get excited when things like that are happening.
Yeah, definitely. It's been incredible also just to kind of see, you know, we'll have people come back where they're like, "Hey, we came to the last one. Like, what's the next event?" So we're like, "Okay, great. We've turned into partially an event promoter too."
Yeah, it's one thing becomes the next. Your spring 2024 collection, I think masculine, feminine, explore this hyper masculinity idea. How do you see your contribution to the conversation around gender expression in fashion?
Yeah, I think I- there's I think a lot of conversations in general being had in the last five or if longer years around like one, what does it mean to make like genderless clothing or gendered clothing, and kind of how does that function? Like, I think for us, I think this exploration of like masculinity and like a sensual masculinity has kind of been more so thinking about, one, how do we visually depict that within like our imagery and like our creative? And then I think two, for the clothing itself, it's been, you know, an important kind of distinction on like kind of juxtaposing these elements, within like, yeah, you'll see like these design details that feel a little bit more sensual or, a little bit expressive, but they're on like very masculine garments, so that's why like one of the items that we make that we've had a lot of fun like kind of iterating on are like some of our sports jerseys, and so I think for our designer, he is someone that didn't play sports, but I think like really appreciates the the kind of pageantry of it in terms of like uniforms and like jerseys and whatnot. And so that's why like, we've done this one football jersey that says like Joy Boy on the back, but it's in this like kind of sparkly like mesh fabric, you know what I mean? And so it's like it's this very traditionally like extremely hyper masculine piece, but then it's like remade with a fabric that kind of gives it a bit of a softer, a bit more of an expressive touch. And so, I think for us, it's, our biggest priority is how do we make pieces that feel, not only like compelling and interesting, but are also accessible. And so I think in kind of like that way, like, our hope and kind of contributing to this larger conversation around like gender expression within fashion is just like, how are we able to make things that, are can cater to different people in terms of like what their comfort level is and what they're, feeling like they are allowed to wear, feel like they have the permission to wear, but also simultaneously like, making things that are still accessible enough that like, it is something that isn't like, oh gosh, like, if I step outside of this, like, will I look like too eccentric or what have you, versus, feeling like, yeah, like this, I feel powerful in this, but also like, feel good in the way that like I'm able to kind of step a little bit outside of my comfort zone in order to wear something like this.
Yeah, and that's a kind of follow up on the next question is how do you navigate like potentially controversial themes or collaborations without alienating your customer base? Do you feel pressure to make clothes that speaks to what's going on in the world right now, or you're more interested in doing what true to the brand and to the collaborator?
Yeah, I think, that's a challenge in general for I think most creatives. It's kind of like, how does your work speak to what's going on around us, but also simultaneously like if it isn't informed by anything around you, is it actually like saying something, So I think for us it's like it is a necessary question that like, we kind of think about sometimes in terms of like, all right, cool, like, as we're making things, like what, like where do these pieces come from, in terms of like what is the significance of this, like, or where is this inspired by, and so on and so forth. I think, for our collaborators and whatnot, they so much of their work is informed by personal narrative. And so I think, for example, like, when I mentioned the Korean wrestling figures earlier, like, that collaborator, she was inspired by like watching Korean wrestling matches with her grandfather growing up, and so she was like, oh well, I know that the brand means the father, and like, given your guys's kind of exploration of like, masculinity and whatnot, like I would love to kind of have this inform like, what I'm creating for our collaboration. So, I think in those ways, like, yeah, I think those kinds of conversations and like explorations of like things happening around us will naturally kind of come into the clothes, just by the nature of like, either the folks we're working with or even, what we're kind of thinking about. I think, from thinking about our customer base and whatnot, I would like to think that everyone that, has been a fan of the brand and whatnot is here for the ride. And, obviously like there may be things, that might not always land, but in my mind, I feel like it's pretty, we've built up a lot of goodwill in terms of how, we've gone about depicting things and creating things. And I think like, as long as things are made in good faith and that there's like a real conversation to be had around it. I feel like that's generally what matters.
Now, talking about a little bit about your background and everything else, what was like for you growing up? What was like your upbringing? How did you start getting invested? If you say you're in music, but you were interested in art and fashion for a young age, how this whole thing began?
Yeah, no, so for me, I grew up in Florida, which isn't necessarily like the biggest cultural hub, but I think I really loved in many ways just the accessibility of kind of like, there's like pop punk shows and different concerts and things that I could go to as a kid. And then, I grew up singing like Indian classical music, and then that kind of led me into starting to produce and making music and then DJing, and then like that kind of translated into like once I got to college into like producing for a bunch of artists and opening for touring musicians that would come through our college, and then that shifted into me starting an indie label like while I was still in college and starting to manage artists, and then that eventually transitioned into finally working in music like full time. But the original plan wasn't actually to work in a creative field. I was always thinking about working in politics. I'd been interning. I'd interned in like the Obama White House, and then in a few other like policy shops in DC, and kind of music and like other creative endeavors were always kind of like a side hustle, for lack of a better word. And so I think for me, eventually, it was just it was this thing that was just kind of like, I was like, all right, cool. Like I have like, this is the thing I want to do for a job. And then this is the stuff that actually sustains me. And then eventually I kind of like, as I got to like the end of college, I was like, you know what, I don't really know if I want to work in DC. And so that led to me thinking about like, yeah, I've been doing all of this work in music for all these years and have met like an incredible network of people, and might as well just go and explore that. And so that's kind of how I found myself in music. But yeah, I think I joke that so much of the work that I'm doing now has been kind of in a way like or like an evolution of like things I wanted to do 5 years ago, and so on and so forth. So I feel like what I've really enjoyed is being able to bring different people together and like effectively like have some kind of like group project, which is really what it all is. It's just like, yeah, like when I the indie label was the same thing, with this, it's so much of it does feel like a fun school project where it's just like, all right, cool, like we're bringing together all these different folks that do like cool things. Like, how can we like make this or tell this story, and figure this out.
Do you miss performing? Do you miss being in the crowd like that at night and being able to get people like DJ, get people to move and that energy around it?
Yeah, no, it's fun. I think there is something like incredible about that aspect of like a live performance, where it's just like, it's like, all right, cool. Like I have like real time feedback, with people in front of me of like, all right, like they're either enjoying this or they'll let you know if they're bored, And so I've been lucky enough, obviously being in New York, that it's like I can still DJ, and like, I think even with that, from like both like the PÈRE side and also like, just personally, it's like having a vehicle to be able to do events, I think has just kind of been a nice way to dip my toe back into it. And that too, I think like, we've made it a point to have a DJ equipment set up at our stores. So it's always, even if it's like on an informal kind of like, all right, like let's just get a bunch of friends together and hang out and like drink some wine and like, spin some music. So
What was like the conversation with your family when you said, I'm going from an intern at the White House to creating an independent music label?
it's funny. I think they were like, that sounds fine, but please don't, forget to do your work. And like, I think my parents have been very, and I'm extremely grateful for this. I think they've extended me a lot of trust and belief in that, in being able to pursue the things that I want to pursue. I feel like there's rightfully or wrongfully a stereotype about like immigrant families where it's like, oh, like, I don't know, like that's like, why don't you choose a more like reliable career path or go do something that people like, that we understand or know. But I feel like, my parents were and continue to be, really supportive and incredible about just like, yep, this makes sense. I understand that why you want to go do this. Like, I can see that you're really passionate about it, and yeah, we'll support you all the way. So I think, for them, obviously, like, yeah, it would have been nice if I like stayed in DC and been closer to home and like worked in politics, absolutely. But I think they were, when the opportunity came up when I was like graduating, and I was like, hey, like I just got a job offer in LA to go work for, to go help start this label and go do that. They were like, sure, we'll miss you, but go for it.
That's so important to hear. I think
Yeah.
people really overlook the importance of have somebody get your back, right? Your parents, a mentor or a friend, someone to kind of believe what you're doing. So it's great that you had that for, early on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. As to sometimes I'm like I don't fully know if they completely understand what I'm doing, but we'll take the small wins,
At the end of the day, as long as they know we're okay, we're paying the bills, and we're being decent
Yeah,
citizens, they're okay with that.
yeah, definitely, definitely.
uh, Abby, what's your relationship with criticism?
Can you do you,
What I mean by,
yeah, yeah,
are
sorry if you
you
wouldn't mind.
someone who act more on the defensive side? Do you welcome it? Do you overthink it when you read something about the brand that perhaps you don't agree or about your work? Is it something that keeps you up at night? Can you brush it off? Can you digest it and move on, or at least take actions to, take that criticism to become something as an opportunity?
Yeah, no, I think criticism's super important. I think, it's not only one. I don't think there is a world where anything interesting or compelling gets made or happens without criticism. I think the scariest thing would be to like build something like we have and to receive no criticism. I think for me, I I appreciate criticism in that it gives me a moment to kind of have a beat of like introspection and think about like, okay, cool. I am seeing this from somebody else's perspective. I think what's important about criticism when it is valid or like there's things that are things that can be kind of applied from it. Yes, absolutely. I think that's great. I think otherwise, if someone didn't like something you did, and frankly, like it's like that's either an issue of taste or like just personal preference or whatever. It's kind of like, yeah, there will always be those people. And so I think it's important, with criticism, for me at least, to be like, listen to it, hear it, and then kind of just goldfish memory, just move on. And I think otherwise it's so easy to kind of get bogged down. I think especially in creative work with like, oh man, like what will they think of the next thing that we do, or like what will they think of this, or I don't know. It just kind of starts to create, I think, unnecessary questions that, while from time to time it's important to kind of think about those things, I feel like it just can really stifle a creative process and like someone's ability to just be like, all right, like I already, it's, I think we all put enough pressure on ourselves. I think it's not helpful to find yourself in a situation where you're like, all right, like I can't even like, I have like analysis paralysis because like I can't make a step forward because I'm like so worried or bogged down in like what they might say, what someone might say about like a decision I chose to make like creatively. And I think, oh, sorry to cut you
No,
off.
no,
I
go
think
ahead, go ahead.
like, I think my favorite artists in general are people that, one of my favorite examples, especially in music, are artists that have been going for like 10 years, and then people are like, wow, like they really made it, or like whatever. And it's like, yeah, well, what gave them that longevity was like the ability to just shut out, early criticism and people being like, oh, this is half baked, or like this isn't fully there yet, or I don't see what they're doing, or what have you. And like kind of allowed them to just develop the reps of like, all right, I truly believe in this thing that I'm trying to create, and this either like style or like this sound or like this kind of avenue that I'm exploring, like I'm going to really just kind of hone my skills and my ability to kind of create that and like continue to create that. And then eventually, like, I think people catch on. And so I feel like criticism in that way, like, it is super important. What's also more important is the ability to be able to, like, just, I think, really just truly shut it out and, like, kind of, like, keep going.
If I was going to ask some of your closest friends to describe you, what do you think they would say?
I think on given the day, they might say, a little relentless, but I think that's more so just out of enthusiasm. I think my friends probably would describe me as someone that goes out of their way for people. I think also as someone that really loves to bring people together. And yeah, I'd like to say that they'd say that I'm pretty thoughtful and kind. So,
Well, before I let you go, there are three questions I ask everybody on the show, and it's a couple of recommendations. So I want you to recommend us a book, something that you read recently, or one of your favorites, something to watch, a movie, documentary, TV show, something to listen while you were in the industry for how long, something to check it out, and the last but not least, our next guest. Who should we have here next?
okay. Book, I think one of my absolute favorite books of all time is House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende. I think that is a book I come back to every other year, just in terms of how, you know, beautifully it's written, but also just kind of like this like multi-generational family story, you know, kind of that is obviously partially biographical, you know, about her family. And so, and you know, the book is very much grounded in like magical realism, kind of similar to like a Gabriel Garcia Marquez and whatnot. So that's the book. Movie is a harder one. I think there, I'm probably gonna get skewered no matter what I say, but I think, you know, for me, I'm a big Star Wars fan, and I think one of my favorite things from like this, you know, new generation of Star Wars IP has been Andor, the TV show with Diego Luna. I think it's a really sick like spy thriller set in the Star Wars universe that has nothing to do with like, you know, Jedi's, any of the more like mystical elements of the universe, which, you know, when you describe it that way, like I feel like would sound boring, but ironically it's
I
anything
agree
but.
100%. It's a phenomenal show.
Yeah, it's so big fan of Andor. Recommend something to listen to. I think I of late have just been rinsing this new Floating Points album. I feel like that might not be the most palatable for everyone, but it's definitely, I think, on a nice workout, or just even if you're like walking down the street and like just kind of need to zone out. I absolutely love this new album. So that's my three recs. In terms of people to have on, can you give me like buckets? Would you prefer like a creative or?
Anybody. It can be anyone that you think it would be great to listen to, or something that somebody who have an interesting point of view to add to the conversation, or someone who's just fun and can run their mouth and have a good time.
Yeah. You know, I would love my dear friend Max Friedrich just wrote an incredible play called Job that has been, I think, is just finishing its run on Broadway, and it stars Peter Friedman from Succession and Sidney Lemon. And I think Max is a incredibly insightful and funny person, and so I think, yeah, that would be my next plug.
Just seeing your reaction, your face reaction when you said his name, I'm like, yeah, that sounds like should be a good one.
Yeah, he's a trip, so I feel like you guys would have a fun chat.
I mean, when I had the chance to read a little bit more about the brand and see what you guys are doing, and I was super impressed. I was thinking this is such an exciting new thing, and it's very original, and it's very, you can tell it's, you know, it's something from the heart. And now being able to spend some time with you, getting to know a little bit more and with questions, I'm even more invested in the brand. I think this is the whole point of building a culture and building a community, right? Because now I want to be part of the club. You know, I want to go to those events. I want to, you know, own a piece of clothing. And that's because of the work you guys have been doing so well. So I want to congratulate you so for that. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Yuri. I think it was really wonderful to chat with you, and thank you for the thoughtful questions. It was very.
Before you go, can you tell everybody how they can, you know, learn more about the brand or find you online and all those things?
Yes, absolutely. So please check out our website, www.lepere.com. Follow us on Instagram, like at Lepere. And if you are in New York, come on down to 90 Orchard Street and stay tuned for our store in LA, which will be on the corner of Melrose and La Cienega.
Awesome. All right, brother. Thanks again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. So good to meet you.